A new report shows while tariffs on American goods coming into China have increased, those from other countries have fallen. What does this mean for U.S. businesses? Also on the show, as the United Nations Volunteers Program experiences an uptake in participants, how can this manpower be used more effectively to help achieve the world's development goals? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. More evidence is emerging that the U.S. tariffs against China are causing self-inflicted damage to America. The latest proof comes from a non-partisan think tank in Washington, the Peterson Institute for International Economics. A recent institute report highlights the dramatic impact of the tariffs inside China, which is home to the world's largest consumer market, I should say. In the years since the Trump administration launched a trade war between the world's two biggest economies, average Chinese tariffs of 8% on all foreign imports has leapt to nearly 21% on U.S. products, yet it has dropped to 6.7% for all non-American products. What explains these trends? What do they mean for Chinese consumers? And what impact will it have on U.S. businesses in the short and long term? Joining the discussion in the Beijing studio is Sitao, the chief economist with Deloitte China, and from New York, Max Wolff, a founding partner of Multivariate Solutions, a financial consulting company. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Let's take a closer look at that chart once again. I would like to have it back on your screen. And as you can see, this is the comparison between Chinese tariffs on American imports versus Chinese tariffs on all other economies. The red one obviously is the U.S. line, and the blue one at the bottom, very steadily decreasing actually, is the tariff level for countries that's outside the United States. And we can see in January last year, the tariff level for both economies, all of these economies, stood around 8%, but the two lines deviated from each other around the middle of last year, and then you can see a very sharp rise of the U.S. tariff line going all the way to about 13% in September last year. And there was a slight dip which happened after U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping agreed to have a tariff truce after they met in Buenos Aires last year. And yet, as the situation continued to deteriorate, as the United States continued to use this maximum pressure tactic on China, Chinese tariffs against the United States continue to rise at an even faster rate. As of June the 1st, the average tariff on American imports stood at some almost 21%, whereas the average tariffs for all other economies stood at a much lower level of 6.7%. I have to remind our readers that this calculation of tariffs is according to this Peterson Institute. The Chinese calculation of tariffs is slightly different, actually lower than 8% according to Chinese official numbers. The tariff level around January 2018 was actually 7.5%, and that number was actually 9.8%, and that number lower to 7.5% in the winter of last year. So, having explained the background situation, Mr. Xu, let me go to you here. Exactly what are the reasons behind such sharp difference between Chinese tariffs against American products and Chinese tariffs against products from all other economies?
Well, the short answer is you are seeing the substitution effect, also called a diversion of trade, because you have to source from other places. So that's not an ideal situation for all parties involved. So I do agree with Peterson Institute general conclusion, and the tariffs is going to result in lose-lose situation. But I also want to point that out, that spike perhaps is slightly misleading, because until this point, the reactions from the Chinese government in terms of raising tariffs have been rather measured. So I tend not to use the average tariff rate.
Would you elaborate a little bit? Because, you know, from this chart, you feel like there is a massive wall of tariffs,
Yeah,
right,
no,
from
no.
China against
Yeah.
imports from the United States.
Sure.
And yet, if you look at, break it down into details,
Yeah.
there are very restricted sectors, right?
Sure.
And the level of the tariffs is but yet, why are we seeing these
So,
big
for
differences
example,
here?
right,
Yeah.
the reason I say the reactions from China so far have been calibrated and relatively measured, and to keep retaliations at a minimum, which is correct strategy. So for some items, for example, things we don't really consume, and you see a huge jump, but that really doesn't affect most people. So, but if you look at the average, my God, that's a huge spike.
Looks like a huge Skype. Mr. Max, Mr. Wolff, tell us a little bit, however, the reasons behind such drastic changes in just the numbers. Because if a lot of people in the United States, I understand, have the impression that it is China who are hurting the U.S. farmers. It is China who are hurting the U.S. companies. Is it really the truth here? Is it really the reality in your eyes?
Yeah, no, so I think that's a little bit of a misleading oversimplification. So, look, I think the chart actually tells an interesting story. So, basically, you have a global free trade regime that's fairly successful, despite some issues and some constituencies or groups in all the countries. There are always some folks who do not benefit, but the overall benefits consistently outweigh the costs. And then you have a kind of sudden, more or less unilaterally started breakdown in that free trade regime, and that's when the two lines stop being identical, right? Look like they were drawn on top of each other, and then they begin a path of rising divergence. So you end up at a point, you know, few months into the future, where one tariff regime, at least on an average, is about 3 times the other, and that's really a trade war. So what this chart is showing you is the unilateral breakdown of free trade momentum initiated by the U.S., resulting in a trade war that has created what trade wars always do: lots of victims and no winners. And what that looks like in this graph is an 18% to 21% sort of range where we're at right now in terms of U.S. goods, and a lower range for the rest of the world's goods coming to China. And I think the bigger issue that folks have taken their eye off here is when you maintain these kind of differentials around the world in free trade, basically our supply chains evolve rapidly, and you start to structurally impair the future of whoever's left out in the cold. And unfortunately for us in the U.S., it's our producers and exporters left out in the cold.
Let's take a look at another chart, which I think is more telling probably compared to the game of numbers, let's say. And the second chart is about the actual volume, the development of exports volume to China from the United States and from all other economies. Again, the red line is the U.S. exports, and the blue line is exports into China from other economies. And you can see around October last year, when the trade war really started to sink in, the U.S. export volume to the United States dropped considerably. So, Sitao, although from the numbers it's a bit difficult to tell the story, then here we are really looking at you know, reality on the ground. What does that mean for U.S. businesses?
Well, I think probably this can be explained by a few major items. For example, agriculture. In past few months, China has been buying a lot more from a country like Brazil, right? So, and cutting down soybean buying from the United States. So that's really the substitution effect you see on the chart.
Mr. Wolff, how do you look at the prospect for American businesses and American farmers, for instance, at this moment? Do you see the trend continuing in the mid to long term, or do you see this could be easily fixed so long as soon as the two countries reach some kind of agreement? Because let's not forget, while American businesses are losing market share here in China, companies from around the world are gaining shares in the Chinese market, and it doesn't feel like that these things can be readjusted overnight.
Well, certainly I think in the short term it's hard to be extremely optimistic, although we obviously have some very short term this week. We have some big meetings that could begin a process of moving us back onto a repair track, which would be good. Longer and intermediate term, I have to be optimistic. While there has been great pain, and the charts tell that story, this is still pretty recent an event, right? So going back to just January, which is, extremely recent on a historical or structural basis, we can see things were pretty good. So, the good news is that we were able to break it. It always takes longer to fix than to break, sadly, but not that much longer. So we could be back on track in a year or two. The caution I would have, the only thing that would sort of impair my optimism is I do think as we get very close to the election cycle in the U.S., might be harder to get compromise, one, and two, damage is cumulative from trade disputes. So 3 days of trade dispute is a lot worse than 3 times 1 day of trade dispute. Duration is a major risk here.
Sitao, your take? What is your reaction to what Mr. Wolff just said about the duration of the war here?
Well, first of all, if the extreme case would be 25% tariffs across board. If that's the case, for many companies, that means you permanently give up that market. And U.S. market is the biggest market for China, and China also exporting through Hong Kong to the U.S. So that's the second round effect. But I don't think 25% is likely, because that would result in huge damage. And I do echo the point made by our colleague in the U.S. I think there could be some positive news coming from Osaka meeting this weekend.
How are Chinese businesses and American businesses who are here in China coping with, let's say, how are American businesses operating here in China coping with the situation with the heightened tariffs and with the prolonged uncertainties at home?
There are many ways to look at that. In general, I think for companies with relatively higher degree of localization, you tend to be more resilient to higher tariffs. But of course, if you are using China as production and for exports, you'll be very vulnerable. The good news, increasingly many U.S. companies are coming to China because of domestic market, because of Chinese consumers.
Okay, so you are still on a relatively positive note, you would say here? Yeah. Okay. Mr. Wolff, how much, though, do you think the situation is being understood, the message is getting out to the American general public? Because President Trump has talked about from early on that a trade war is easy to win, and obviously from what is being seen here, clearly the United States is not winning, and China is not winning either. But definitely the trade war has not turned out to be a very easy win for him. So how much do you think this what we're talking about here, what we're trying to highlight here, could potentially really get across to the American general public? And how much of a problem do you see that is?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think, unfortunately, the support or lack of support for these trade policies has become a little bit of a partisan issue and a litmus test in the U.S. for sentiment around Donald Trump, which is, I think, unfortunate. The truth here is really about what kind of economic future Americans want to see for themselves, for their children and grandchildren, and for the greater world around them. And I think we've a bit lost sight of that in our national debate. I do think there's plenty of discussion, plenty of news agencies doing good work, like the Peterson Institute, who has historically done very, very good work, often as the Institute for International Economics, their previous title, and has continued to do good work. I think the academic and business community would like to see this trade dispute end as soon as possible, and I think folks remain somewhat optimistic that it would be a feather in the cap of the re-election efforts of the Trump administration to announce a deal. The question is, it does seem that the American decision makers, the policymakers, have systematically underestimated the damage and the potential of this trade dispute.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to Sitao from Deloitte China and Max Wolff from Multivariate Solutions. You have been watching The Point. Coming up after a short break.